Okay, so good afternoon. This topic that we're going to talk today about is running an open source, successful open source project. I guess before we begin, is anybody in the audience actually currently running an open source project? Show of hands. No, does anybody really want to? Okay, cool. All right. My name is Wayne Beaton. I am the Director of Open Source Projects at the Eclipse Foundation. My role there is to help make open source projects successful. Part of that is making project teams themselves successful. And of course, success has a particular meaning at the Eclipse Foundation. I'm here with my good friend Gunnar Wagenknecht. Close?
Yeah, that's fine.
Close.
That's awesome. I work at Salesforce. I do have a very long history in open source, especially also with Wayne and the Eclipse Foundation. And my role is, as a developer, I try to keep Wayne busy with a lot of stuff. Yeah, so...
oh, this is my slide.
Okay, go ahead.
So before we begin, it's important to understand what your definition of success is before we even start. For many, the definition of success in an open source project is to have code in a repository that is publicly accessible. For others, the definition is a little bit different, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the aspects that make things different. But again, I guess before you can work towards creating a successful open source project, you must know what successful actually means to you. So to begin that, we figured we would lay down a little bit of background to understand what an open source is and how open source software actually works. A typical open source software project really doesn't exist. There's no one single definition. Open actually means a lot of things to different people. We tend to think about open source projects using a couple of important words, transparency being one of them. Transparency is really the act of working in such a way that others can pay attention to what you're doing. This takes the form of using a publicly accessible issue tracker. This takes the form of actually doing development in the publicly accessible software repository. If you are working on a bunch of code and it's behind your firewall, and every once in a while, every month or so, you throw it out to the community and let the community use it, that's not a very transparent way of operating. It's hard for anybody to really understand what you're doing if your development is happening behind closed doors. This also takes the form of, for example, when you have a meeting with the project developers, telling people what you decided in that meeting, capturing actual minutes and making them available in a forum where others can consume them. And again, that could be in an issue tracker, that could be in a mailing list. There's all sorts of forms that can take. Having actual forums where people can interact, answering questions that people ask, those kinds of things are ways of a project team acting in a transparent way. Openness is a little bit different. Now, I guess it really depends on the nature of the open source project. For some people, open is the same thing as transparent. Open book, I guess, being the definition. We tend to think of open as being having a broader definition. Open is really more about being open to others participating in your project. We often talk about there being a level playing field in an open source project, whereby anybody can show up to the project, and as long as they follow the same set of rules that everybody else plays along with, they get to participate. And a project that's running in a truly open manner would be receptive to somebody showing up with new ideas, would accept code and contributions from people who perhaps work for a different organization. This leads into meritocracy. When people show up to your project and they actively participate in your project, as they participate, as they demonstrate that they know what they're doing, as they demonstrate that they're adding value to the project and to the community, you give them more responsibility. So somebody shows up and they contribute code after demonstrating over some period of time that they know what they're doing, you make them a committer so that they can actually write code directly into the repository themselves and work alongside the rest of the team members. Perhaps after demonstrating value to the project and understanding of the project and demonstrating leadership, they may be moved into a leadership position into the project. Again, meritocracy is really more about what people do, not necessarily where they work or other less important aspects. Most open source foundations also manage a notion of vendor neutrality. The idea is that no single vendor, no single organization can dominate the project. The idea being that the foundation will hold the project, maybe hold the project name, the trademark for the project name, in trust for the community that forms around the project. So again, so that no one vendor can attempt a coup or take over the project. And then of course, finally, we get to code and documentation. Open source projects are, of course, software projects, and software projects need code. And then rules. How do you participate? I talked earlier about a level playing field. Level playing fields require that you define the playing field. How do people participate in your project?
Right, and speaking of people, that's actually a very good topic. There's many different people in any project, especially in open source. There's also various roles that you see in a typical open source project. Of course, there's the, we're listing a few of things. Let's start with the owners. What does ownership mean for an open source project? Now, if you think of an open source project at GitHub, GitHub basically is just an infrastructure for hosting projects. The project really could belong to anyone, the one that pushed it, like a corporation, whatever. Typically, they hold the trademark and any such thing. So if they decide the next day they shut it down, or to commercialize it, it's gone. Well, there's still the history, and that might be forks, but theoretically, that's actually why you have the foundations, right? If you pick a foundation for your open source project, you would transfer the ownership of those items to the foundation. Now, ownership doesn't mean that the owner necessarily actually performs the work on the project, right? The work on a project, it is performed by committers, by developers, by leaders that manage and run the project. It could be project management, task release management, or technical architects that just like make the decisions, the important decisions of the project. And of course, any like successful, and again, it depends on what level of success you define or you want to set for yourself. But contributors is also a very important aspect of open source, right? Because they actually start building together with other members. They start building the community as a whole, right? So you have people participating in an open source project, collaborating, and of course that requires some rules or some policies written somewhere to make sure that everyone follows the same or works along the same principles. Now, as Wayne said, I'd like to say it's more easy to be transparent than to be open. But any people on those open source projects can help make a difference here. And once you start building a community, you realize that this community can be a big help or a big accelerator for your open source projects. Sometimes there are people that just love the technology, so they will go out to conference, talk about it, and spread the word. So actually, it's good for marketing, from a marketing point. And also, and also the impact that a community has on a cultural perspective is also a big benefit for your brand, for the open source project itself.
So open source foundations provide, as we've mentioned before already, vendor neutrality, gives a place where you can go and work without concern for a single vendor dominating. Governance models are valuable. Governance model may take the form of basic structure of how projects are organized. It may inform us on how releases are presented to the community. Is there a formal notion of a release? What is the structure around that? At the Eclipse Foundation, we have a governance model that's really about building products in the open source context. And the governance model provides the background, provides the framework for that. Governance, again, takes the, defines how we do reviews. It defines who has responsibilities and the various roles and that sort of thing. Open source foundations may also provide resources and services. I'll talk about some of the services that the Eclipse Foundation and Apache Foundation and others provide. Open source foundations may also provide marketing support and other forms of communicating, helping projects connect with the community and get a message out to a user community, to an adopter community, to a developer community, and help people work together.
And of course, the community doesn't build by itself, right? So you have to, and that's also important to realize when you're starting an open source project, you also have to invest into your community to get it off the ground. And first, well, not first, but like one easy thing to do is not just like working with your technology internally, but also making sure that any users out there get the help that they need. This requires, in the beginning, or actually, yeah, in the beginning, this requires setting time aside by developers, committers on the project itself to make sure that if there are any user questions, they be answered or helped. It requires some time management, but it's actually very valuable because over time, the users that have questions in the beginning find answers later, and then those users start helping other users. That's actually an ideal situation, right? So once you enable a few users building a few, especially those that are very interested in your project, building like the kind of leaders in the user community, they gain the knowledge and then they start helping other users. Keep them engaged, that's very important. Now, once you actually reach a critical point, you have to make sure that your community is also, I wouldn't say behaving properly, but kind of like you have some participation rules that allows everyone, or as many people as possible to participate in your project. As Wayne said already in the beginning, this is also about transparency and openness. Now, you can be transparent pretty much, and you publish release notes, you publish meeting notes, you have internal developer discussion in a public mailing list associated with a project. If people show up with ideas and you don't like react to them, you ignore them, then eventually people will go away. Because like they want to, you have to be open to really, even if like sometimes the ideas might not be the best in the best interest for the project or for your plans for the roadmap of the project. It shows interest in the project, and it might help to incorporate some of those ideas into the roadmap, not necessarily in the way the user wants them to have, but let's say, for example, sometimes you can just implement a smaller thing that enables other users to build extensions or build other cool things with your project. That makes them happy, and that keeps them engaged with the project. And when people actually show up and provide bug reports, don't just ignore them, right? Oh, of course, go to conferences, right? Talk about your project, and what happens at conferences, you can connect with your user bases, because there are connections, there are receptions, there's events where you can just talk to them. It doesn't have to be a conference, it can also be a local user group. Right? Wherever you think like you will reach out to a user base, just do it. Okay, so we talked a lot about community. Another big thing is the actual code or code contributions, how to deal with those. That's what we're going for the remainder of the minutes. And now, when people start contributing code to you, It can be in various different forms. It might be small bug fixes, and it might be actually features. Make sure that when people do the time in the community and do the investment to contribute code to them, they are prepared as best as possible. It really helps if you as a project have documented your coding conventions, right? So that people that submit a bug fix with know ahead of time what your wishes are regarding to code formatting or to like naming conventions, etc. Right? Also, if you run a mailing list, like a contributor mailing list or developer mailing list, that's also a good way to engage with people that like to start building on a larger feature. Right? So you can work with them together on, let's say, for example, the design. And actually, sometimes it is time-consuming as a developer, from a developer perspective, but it really helps building the next level for your open source project, right? Because you're showing interest in not just being transparent, but also being open.
So part of your code is how you choose to allow others to make use of your code. Selecting a license for your project is an important consideration, and it's something that software developers, that's really not our best thing, or it's not our favorite thing to think about the legal implications. But how do you want people to use your code? Do you want your code to be used in such a way that if anybody uses your code, that they must make their code available publicly as well? Is your code meant to be used in commercial products? Proprietary products? Is your code meant to be used only by other open source projects? So there's lots of different considerations for a license selection. There's the OSI provides a very long list of open source project licenses. There is also choosealicense.com, which will step you through how you might go about choosing a license. There's a fatal flaw in choosealicense.com in that they make it relatively hard to find the Eclipse public license. But anyway, they're still a good resource for selecting a license. But this is the kind of thing that you need to be careful about and getting right relatively early in the project makes things a lot easier, especially if you subscribe to some of our definitions of success and you wind up with lots of people contributing. This sort of leads into another topic a bit later too, is how do you accept code contributions? Who are the owners of the code? If ever you have to change a license to do it properly, all of the owners have to agree to that license change. Again, depending on the license. Some licenses actually have a stipulation for changing licenses. So anyway, this is not something to take lightly. It's something to spend a little bit of time on early on in the project.
Can I make one remark?
No. Go.
So whatever you do, make sure you pick an OSI-approved license. Like, don't try to invent your own. That's really, it's really difficult because, like, if you want your code to be adopted by larger corporations, having an OSI-approved license really helps here, right? Because then, otherwise, they need to like get their lawyers involved, review the terms, conditions. There might be issues then, and usually these days, the large corporations they have review systems in place, and if like there's an unknown license popping up in a project, it's usually a red flag already.
So there is a license. The OSI reviews and will reject licenses occasionally. There's a license that we run into every once in a while, the JSON license. It has a clause in it that the code is intended to be used for good and not for evil, which sounds really fun and everything like that. And who could argue with that? Well, it turns out lawyers. Apparently, evil is legally ambiguous. So anyway, those are, again, as Gunnar was saying, a vanity license, making your own license is potentially problematic. Anything that's OSI approved makes it relatively easy for most organizations to adopt it, assuming that the terms are also acceptable. But again, OSI licenses are something that people understand. Manage copyright in your project. Now, copyright is basically who owns stuff. And it's not always obvious who owns stuff. Some open source projects require that you assign ownership of your contributions to the project. Some do not. The Eclipse Foundation, for example, does not take ownership of anybody's contributions. If you make a contribution to an Eclipse project, you still own it. So that makes relicensing a bit of a challenge, but still, you own your contributions and you are legally entitled to them. Now, again, it's a little bit more potentially complicated than that. As the author, chances are you have an employment contract which grants all works of the mind that you create to your employer. So it's more likely that your employer owns the copyright. With Eclipse projects, most projects do this differently. With Eclipse projects, we require that a copyright statement be put right directly into the code header that goes with every bit of source file, every source file. So I'm showing here an example, copyright 2017, the Eclipse Foundation. Now, I probably should change this because it's a bit misleading. I actually work for the Eclipse Foundation, so if I put a file header into something, that's the file header I will do. However, if you were doing it, you would put your own company name then. Again, if you were contributing to an Eclipse project. Something that we've been really investigating, and I think, well, I've certainly bought in to them, and we're working on disseminating this to our broader community, is SPDX. SPDX is a way of specifying a license in a machine-understandable way. As it is, we do have tools that are capable, like Fossology, for example, that is capable of scanning a code base and determining licenses based on the text of licenses. And it does a pretty good job, but it's relatively easy to fool when you get into things like dual licensing scenarios. With SPDX, there's actually a syntax. So there's the second highlighted line there, SPDX license identifier. This is a standardized way that an SPDX scanner can figure out what licenses you are expressing in a file. And there is a syntax for joining licenses. So you can say that this is EPL 1.0 and it is Apache license 2.0. You could also say there's an or condition. You can pick one. I think there's a condition for parts of, certain parts are licensed in certain ways, right? So the SPDX allows us to be fairly expressive. SPDX also has an enhanced file format that lets you specify a great deal more information in a separate file. So you can specify who are the actual copyright owners, nature of the code, basically get much more information about the provenance of the code, which is something that, again, people who are commercial adopters tend to care about. One of the things, and we run into this all the time with Eclipse projects and other projects, generally a project, an open source project, is not itself a legal entity. When you express a copyright, the copyright needs to be held by a legal entity. So it's never going to be copyright the Eclipse project, for example, or something along those lines. Depending on the rules, this is optional for Eclipse projects. You can actually make an absolute list of contributors directly in a file header if you choose. We're actually investigating some other ways of doing it. Apache does this in a separate file. You have a notices file where you can list copyright holders. Establish guides and conventions. So, Gunnar mentioned this a little bit earlier. Things like make sure your project is actually buildable, but more importantly, as important, I guess having it buildable is pretty important. But if it's something that can be built by somebody, make sure you have documentation that describes how to actually build the code. Put a contribution guide directly into your repository. This is something I think GitHub pioneered, and we latched onto this pretty early. It was right in the root of your Git repository. Put a README file or a contributing file that describes where do you go to put issues, where do you go to do discussions, how do you actually do your build, all of that kind of information that anybody who wants to contribute to your project can actually find and make use of. Now, there's little things in here that might be a little bit subtle. I think it's not hard to think about requiring for a contribution you want to have unit tests, but indicating what kind of patch sizes are reasonable. As a committer on a project, if somebody shows up with a 10,000 line patch, that's going to take a week for me to review. That's going to take a lot of time for me to review and make sure that it's something that fits with the project. It's a good idea to set expectations. Say, hey, you know, if you're coming here, if this is your first time contributing, if you could please limit your patch sizes to a couple hundred lines. Something that I can review in a few minutes, 15, 20 minutes, something that I can actually, you know, get a sense around, because if you make the commit too large, it's just going to take too much time, and depending on, you know, who's paying for my time, I may not have time to even look at that patch, let alone try to accept it, right? So indicating that kind of information to your community is pretty valuable. Coding conventions, coding styles, if you have a favorite IDE, having the metadata for that IDE that describes how to do code formatting included directly in with the project. Having the IDE metadata directly in the project is great. There's some new functionality with Che, the Eclipse Che project, which is browser-based IDEs, where you can clone a Git repository and then say, Che, go, right? And if you provide the right metadata in your repository root, Che knows, oh, okay, I need to go get this, 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 and this, and in the amount of time it takes to download all the pieces, you have a fully functional development environment, right? Make it super easy for your communities to do it. We actually have this new feature relatively new feature in the Eclipse IDE called Oomph, where you can specify a complete configuration, and it will go and pull extra plugins down and configure preferences and set your workspace up for success, basically, to get developing. This is actually more of a be a good citizen, but I find it's a good thing to include in a contribution guide. Tell people to keep their commits focused. The number of times I've gotten a commit where somebody has reformatted the whole file and then changed 2 lines, I can't work with that. I don't, you know, I have to eyeball every line because the diff reports that everything is different. If you're going to reformat a file, cleanup tasks are awesome. A lot of projects love them. But if you're going to do a cleanup task, keep the cleanup task separate from the other contribution. If you have 2, this is the advice to give, and I'm giving advice to you if you're contributing to open source projects as well. But keep your patches focused is the message that you need to send to your contributors. Focus on a particular thing. And that sort of thing. Of course, communication and expectations. Just sort of generally, what do you expect? Define the playing field so that people know that, how to participate in this level playing field. This one's a hard one for us again. As software developers, the whole notion of tracking intellectual property is horrifyingly difficult. When somebody shows up with code, especially if it's a very large patch, there is some risk associated with it. You need to look at it with an eye to, does this code fit with my project scope? Is the code of sufficient quality? But you also need to take a look at that code and think, did they steal this from somewhere else? Software developers copy things. That's kind of what we do. It's part of the job description. If somebody copies a whole chunk of GPL code and drops it into your Apache licensed project, that's a license violation. And somebody could eventually come after you, or even worse, your customers. Well, maybe that's not worse. I guess it depends on how deep your pockets are. Anyway, as you accept contributions, you need to have some sense for knowing who actually wrote the code. Do the people who say they wrote the code, did they actually write it? Do they have permission to actually contribute the code? These are things that are not generally easy to sort out. We actually have a team at the Eclipse Foundation that does this on behalf of our projects. And they are superhuman. I've had our IP team come to me with a printout of some code, because they still print things. A printout of some code that they found in an Eclipse project and a textbook. And I have no idea how they made the match between some code that somebody asked them to look at and a textbook. But they showed me the code and they said, this is similar. Is this just how you do it? right? And they asked me to make a technical assessment for them. And it turns out in that case, it was just sort of like textbook. This is the only way that it would be done. It's just a coincidence that they did it exactly the same way. But we have an IP team that's fantastic at finding these problems. Are you actually allowed to license the code in the way that the project team wants it licensed? If your employer says, no, we only do things under certain licenses, that may prevent someone from being able to contribute to your project. Sorry, I keep switching back between how you contribute to an open source project and how you tell others to contribute to yours. Use a contributor license, a contributor agreement. I put the word license in there. The CLA is kind of a passing fad now. People are moving on to just a contributor agreement, and the distributor, DCO, Developer Certificate of Origin. Yeah. So basically, have your contributors sign an agreement stipulating to the fact that they own what they're contributing, that they're contributing it under the appropriate license, and that sort of stuff. Define an intellectual property management process. This is hard, and it's something that definitely needs to be thought of. The Apache Foundation has a well-defined intellectual property process, and they have some resources for helping you sort that kind of stuff out. And then, of course, nobody does anything completely from scratch. You're dependent on third-party content. Is any third-party content, libraries that you're using, are they compatible with your project license? That actually might be an important consideration when choosing your license initially. Are the third-party libraries that I'm going to depend upon, are they going to be compatible with this license?
And also some background checks, right? Do the libraries you depend on, do they actually have kind of a process for also managing those their third-party dependencies or their code contributions? Chances are if the project you're depending on accepts contribution by email and copies them, there's no way that they're ever gonna be like, can track the route where the code was coming from and if the submitter actually had the right to submit it. This is all about reducing your risk, right? So if you have a process, don't do it by email. It's fine. Some projects actually decide not to go foundation, but they still use their issue tracking system or whatever they have, or pull requests to sort of like establish some small process around this.
So intellectual property management is hard. It's easy. We were at the Linux Foundation's Open Source Leadership Summit a little while ago, and a lot of the thought leaders in open source are really starting to realize how important this is and how hard it is to actually do. Some things that our intellectual property team looks at and things that are important, again, and I've mentioned some of these already, is the license compatible? Is the provenance of the third-party code that you're using or distributing, is the provenance clear? The people who say they authored that code are the actual authors? Are they the actual owners? Do they have the rights to distribute it the way that they say that they do? And then integrity, is the actual license statements in the code, are they actually correct? Has a license changed? I mentioned earlier, changing licenses are hard. If you take a whole bunch of contributions and the people who make those contributions are the owners and you decide out of hand to just change the license, that license change may not actually be valid. So just sort of keep that sort of thing in mind. You can't just willy-nilly change a license. You need to be able to keep track of the stakeholders to be able to do that. And as I was mentioning earlier about third-party content, if you are taking other people's code and including it with your own, you need to make sure that you're conforming to the terms of the license, but you also may be accepting a certain amount of liability for distributing that third-party content, and if its provenance is not clean, you are on the legal path, the legal responsibility path. It may not be you that gets sued, but maybe your consumer may get sued for something that you are yourself consuming. That's hard to think about, but those are things that we need to keep in mind. So requiring a contributor agreement or a certificate of origin is just a great way of providing you a little bit of legal cover. If you accept somebody's contribution, if you know that somebody is somebody is contributing something they shouldn't be, you'd still have a certain amount of liability there. But if you have a contributor agreement in place, what you're doing is, first off, you're sending a message to your contributors saying that intellectual property management is important, please get this right. And then, of course, if they get it wrong, then at least you have an agreement from them that says that they thought they knew what they were doing. A public record of the actually, this is something, the developer certificate of origin that we use at the Eclipse Foundation is the one that the Linux Foundation provides. We decided that doing that made it easier than having our own. It's one of those, the same kind of idea as using an OSI license. Use a developer certificate of origin that already exists, because most legal departments will have already seen it. And if you're trying to attract contributors, they're going to have to agree to that developer certificate of origin. And if their lawyers have already seen it, that's going to be a lot easier than if their lawyers have to review it. One of the things that's in there is a stipulation that the public record of the contribution will be maintained indefinitely. This may be at odds with the right to be forgotten. So that's something, that's actually, I haven't seen that tested yet, but that'll be interesting to see when it does. Protect your trademark. Who owns the product and project name? Again, if you work with a foundation, the foundation is very often the owner of that trademark. Should you register a trademark is an interesting question. We have a legal team that can help you decide that. It really depends on different things. Sometimes just asserting a trademark is enough. Registering a trademark gives you a little bit of a stronger hold on it. Registering is something that's done based on, from country to country. We tend to register trademarks in the United States and in Europe. And that's, again, something, if you're doing your open source project, you may decide whether or not to do. As we've mentioned before, foundations will hold the name on behalf of the community. We, as a foundation, the Apache Foundation does this, all organizations do this, is they provide usage guidelines. How may you use our trademark? We actually will contact people to make sure that our trademark is being used appropriately. There's a lot of Eclipse plugins that are called Eclipse something or other, which actually are a violation, and when we find them, we ask them nicely, and most of the time, they just change the name. The thing about trademarks as well that you have to keep in mind is you do need to actually enforce them in order to keep a hold on them. So that's sort of an important thing. So the Eclipse Foundation, the Apache Foundation, sort of the same idea. If you go to any given Apache page, Apache project page, you'll go to Hadoop, it's Apache Hadoop every time. But only a Hadoop project can call themselves that. If you have an extension, it would be my extension for Apache Hadoop, right? The idea there is that creates some clarity to the reader. If someone reads that, it's obvious that that is not an Apache property. They are instead using an Apache trademark. And then, of course, the trademark is something, the project names, the foundation names, this is something that we try to do. The Eclipse Foundation, the Apache Foundation provide some value to the various open source projects that they hold. And so, Apache Hadoop is a great example. Hadoop has got a great name, Apache's got a great name. Each of those names builds up the other a little bit. Yeah.
So, and now there was a lot of stuff on code IP, but there's a lot more to talk about. And so, how do you perform testing? How to provide support for your project? Sometimes you want to do. Some companies actually have kind of a business model where they have like an open source edition where they actually provide consulting services or support to. Sometimes you want to allow others to participate in that, right? Not just to be transparent, but again, it's the level of success you define for openness. And also there are all sorts of business drivers why you want to do open source, right? Or why do you want to do your project as open source, or why whatever, right? And in the end, a very important topic also in any successful projects, open source projects that we've seen is actually diversity, right? Projects that are diverse are actually more successful than a project that are mostly a single vendor dominated. One thing that isn't on there, but like if you are a corporation and trying to like get more involved into open source, there's a group of companies called the To Do Group, and they actually help each other to understand or actually they also have regular meetings where they just talk about like how they do open source and how they do things. All right, I think now it's time for Q&A.
So of course, diversity takes many forms. Diversity, I think when we start off, we talk about diversity of different organizations participating. So that if one organization loses interest, at least someone is there to maintain the project. Again, this speaks to our definition of success. If your definition of success for your project is that organizations are incorporating it into their products and that you've got an active and vibrant community of 6 million users, or whatever your definition of success is, commands or will help you to decide what of the things that we've talked about today are interesting and useful to you. I've been involved with literally hundreds of different open source projects in one capacity or another, and the single vendor open source projects tend to go away. They tend to live the shortest because as soon as that vendor loses their funding or moves on, the project, no one supports the project dies and goes away. So that diversity of the people involved is really valuable. That and the diversity of ideas. Some of our most successful projects at the Eclipse Foundation have many, many different organizations involved. The team support, the Git integration support in the Eclipse IDE, I think, has 8 or 10 different organizations represented, regularly committing contributions to the code. The original contributors, I believe, have actually gone away, but the project that produces that support has managed to build some top quality tools to do Git integration. Anyway, and then of course our platform team, our main team, they had a real diversity problem in the beginning, but they've really grown and become very diverse, and their continued success is a testament to that. Anyway, so why should you care about anything we've talked about? Again, it really kind of goes back to that first message. How do you define success? And with that, I guess we have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question? Yes?
So you mentioned that contributor agreement is very important to say, right, with your open source project. But if your open source project has a license that says there are no warranties and everything, why is it important?
So, yeah, repeat the question. So I had said that a contributor agreement was important, but if you have a license that states that there is no warranties, why is that contributor agreement important? Why is there, so if I say that there is no warranties, why is the contributor agreement important? Because you still need to have the,
I can take that one.
Yeah, you take that one. I'm having a hard time forming it. If you've got it, go.
So first thing, we're not lawyers, right? So they actually will tell you why. But there's a difference between warranty and intellectual property violation. Even though if you don't provide any warranties for damage your project might do or whatever, chances is high if someone brings code in that was never supposed to be open, and all of a sudden it's in your project, and there's some very large corporation or whoever actually owns the code, then they will after you, no matter what your license is, right? So it's really you want to make sure that the code you license actually fits with the culture, with that license, and you can't not either you review every code by yourself, or you basically sort of with that contributor agreement you sort of delegate the risk away, right? Because you have to process. It's about reducing risk. You cannot verify any single line. Risk for you, for the entity that owns the project. Most of the time, actually, they don't go after the project, after the project, the entity itself. They go after the users of the project, right? Because I don't know if you remember the SEO Unix thing, right? That they went after the customers, and then last they went after SEO.
Yeah. So yeah, it's gone. Never mind.
I guess that the contributor agreement doesn't completely remove the risk, right?
Well, there is no such thing. So the contributor agreement does not remove the risk. There is no such thing as no risk. Everything that we do in intellectual property management is about risk mitigation, right? I did mention, one of the things I did mention, I remember what I was going to say. The contributor agreement by making someone sign the contributor agreement, you're also making them think, right? So maybe they don't fully understand, but by making them sign the agreement, you're getting them to, at least try and understand what they're doing, and maybe, maybe if they're going to copy this code that they got from somewhere, hopefully make them think twice about doing something that, maybe they don't know is wrong. Are there other questions? Yes.
Just to build on that, like if contributor signs an agreement, like would still company, if there is a violation, come after the project, or they would come after the contributor?
So the question is, even if we have this agreement, would somebody come after the project if there were a violation? I think we've probably leaned a little too heavily on the fear aspect in our presentation. So, as Gunnar was saying, actually, generally when there is a license violation, it's actually it's usually downstream where people go, right? So they usually go for the users.
So again, this is lawyer talk, right? But like if you can demonstrate for let's say it comes to the point where they actually go after you, right? But if there's a case that you can demonstrate, you have the process in place, and which is actually the computer agreements and the code and the developer certificate of origin, then chances are pretty high that there's not a lot you have to worry about, right? Because like that's usually taken into account is like, did you violate this on purpose, right? Or did you do the best that you could at that time to prevent such violations? And a contributor agreement, developer certificate of origin is such a thing, right? Right now, it's like the best thing like you can do to prevent such violations.
Mitigate.
Yeah, mitigate. But again, like do it, and that's very well-known practice in the open source communities.
Like I said, there's no such thing as no risk, but yes?
So the contributor agreement, is there some automated way of doing that, or like some practices that you can recommend for that?
So for the committer agreement, is there an automated process or practices that we can recommend? You look like you have an answer.
I do.
Go.
We are, yes, so the to-do group, so the thing is, every company develops itself, like it's their own system. And so within the to-do group, there was recently a discussion of some like moving all like the internal systems that the companies have into open source, and on GitHub you actually find those systems from I think Facebook and Google. They also call, like there's all sorts of tools like open source dashboards where they actually monitor. At the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit, Microsoft gave a very good talk. Microsoft actually, they also have like a tool where they track any single contribution that's going into their projects, right? And also any single contributions that the developers are doing into other contracts. So they all analyze this. And so there are tools available. I think we are also in the process of open sourcing one item, but I'm not sure.
So at the Eclipse Foundation, we do have a process. Very often it's, actually I'm not sure exactly how the Apache Foundation does it, but we have an online form and we have some infrastructure where the information is stored in our database and we're able to query that. Yeah. Different organizations do it in different ways. Some legal jurisdictions will require paper tracking,
but not in these days anymore.
Not so much these days.
Yeah, I remember signing paper and faxing it to Google a long time ago, but these days, like all those contributor agreements are mostly signed electronically.
So I think in terms of, is there a kind of a general service that you can use?
I don't think
I don't think so, right? That's another place where there's the value of participating with a foundation is there.
So we have one more question. Oh, so Apache and Oracle still required to sign a paper and fax it to them.
That's for contributors or for committers? Oh, interesting. Okay, good. Hey, we're easier than Apache. All right, cool. So yeah, with that, thank you so much for your attention. I'm grateful that none of you left. Anyway, I hope you do enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you so much for your attention.